Hi, it's Ted Pattison with our second installment of Building Multi-Language Reports for Power BI in 2023, Part 2, Creating and Testing Metadata Translations. Okay, I'm glad you came back. Let's go ahead and roll up our sleeves and get started. Okay, the first thing we have to come to terms with, is deciding what tool we're going to use to basically add and edit metadata translations. And we'll start with the bad news. Power BI Desktop, being a very popular tool, doesn't itself expose any type of features that allows us to either view or add or edit metadata translations. Don't get me wrong, we're not going to, push Power BI Desktop to the side. It's still going to be involved. It just needs a sidekick, an external tool, that does the work that Power BI Desktop doesn't do itself. So what are our options, for finding some partner for Power BI Desktop, some external tool? And the first one that's been around for a long time, is the tabular editor. Okay, a quick tangent. Okay, I flash back to my second day working at Microsoft. April 1st, 2020, the first official day of the pandemic. You would think April Fools might factor into the story, but it doesn't. But I was told that I needed to participate in helping to localize a project using tabular editor. And so what I did is I kind of learned this process of going into the tabular editor. And while it's tedious, it does it better than any other tool out there. But let's go ahead and, apparently we like to add, some type of a language inside there. So if we go ahead and add French, now we've added that inside there. Now I can go to these data set objects, like the products table or the product column, and we can go down, to the very bottom. And so my first, couple weeks at Microsoft, it was just moving around in this UI and manually copying and pasting. And at the end, I had a very important observation. There has to be a better way. So in summary, tabular editor used as a manual tool to add and edit translations is great, as long as you have, all of time to complete your work. So the developer inside you was saying, well, how do we automate this? So one thing that you're able to do is the tabular editor does have scripting extensions, and you're able to program kind of wrapper objects that wrap the tabular object model, and you'll be able to do things. Another approach would be, not to rely on the tabular editor, but to write your own custom application using C# and the tabular object model, where you'd be able to connect to a data set, either running locally in Power BI Desktop or even in the service, and, use the API of the tabular object model, to, customize the translations however you see fit, or what we're going to use here is Translation Builder. It's a tool that's already been written, and it's a tool that was written specifically, to play the role of assisting content creators using Power BI Desktop who then want to, add and edit translations to build multi-language reports. Exactly what we want. In this guidance, we're going to be using Translations Builder 2.0. There's a previous version from July 2001, but the new version 2.0 released in January of 2023, has many enhancements. And the idea is we want content creators to use this tool as a sidekick to Power BI Desktop, to add the multi-language support to your PBIX projects, whether your project has both a data set and a report, or just a data set or just a report, you're going to be able to use this tool to work with it. Now, what you're going to see is that this tool will provide support for what we're going to look at in this session, working with metadata translations. A little bit later, you'll also see that Translation Builder, gives us a lot of support and assistance to implement report label translations as well. Now let's take a step back before we dive into the details and talk about, what is the core value proposition of this tool? And the idea is Translation Builder allows the user to work in this two-dimensional grid that we'll call the translation grid. And the idea is that a user can then work, in an environment that's much like working with a Excel workbook, but as they make updates, they're being, written back to the Power BI data set, and everything's occurring behind the scenes, so the user continue to focus on, the job at hand. Okay, time to fire it up. Now, after you install Translations Builder, there should be an icon, in the External Tools tab, alongside of your other favorite external tools like the ALM Toolkit, DAX Studio, and Tabular Editor. And the idea is that once you start it up, you're able to, have this tool make a connection, back to that data set that's loaded into memory and running in the local analysis services engine. When we fire up Translations Builder, it's also going to show us, what is the, the connection string, localhost, and what is the port. We can also, display what is the name of the PBX file that you're working with, what's the default language, and there's a compatibility level, that as of today, 1550, is what we should be using. Now, the first thing that happens when you launch Translations Builder is it loads information from the data model. And so what we want to do is take a quick look at the data model, and we'll examine which columns and measures are visible in report view and which ones are hidden. And the idea is that we only load in dataset objects, that are visible in report view, because the assumption there is if it's hidden, it's not going to be shown to the user. It doesn't need to be translated. Okay, let's move back to our lab exercise in Power BI Desktop, and let's go ahead and fire up Translations Builder. I'll click the icon, I'll wait a second, and now it loads in. And what you can see here, is it's loaded in the objects from our data model. If I go back here and I kind of do a comparison, one of the things that we could see is that it's not showing anything that's hidden. It's only showing things, that are visible in report view. Just as a quick example, let's say that I go back to my data model, and I decide that user culture, which I'm using to kind of show the user language and regional identifier, to the user, let's say that I go and I now make that visible. I will come back to the tool, and note that the tool does not react in real time, but there is a sync data model. If up here I click on that, notice that it then kind of reruns the loading logic to load in, what things are public. And one more time, let's go back here, and I'll go ahead and hide that again. We'll go back here, and this time as we click on, here's the button, Sync Data Model. It's basically just to synchronize the tool with what we have in Power BI Desktop. Now, the translation grid will always have at least 4 columns. It will have more than 4 columns once you start adding languages, but let's go through the 4 columns. The first one is the type of object. It's either going to be a table, a column, a measure, a couple other possibilities. There's the property. And so remember, caption is the property for the name, and that's what we're interested in here. Why caption is the main property that we'll be dealing with. Also note that description and display folder are other properties, not as common, but can be used, if your project calls for them. The last thing I want to call out is the 4th column. So there is a default language and locale for each project. In our project, it's EN/US for English in the locale of the United States. And note that there are a set of translations, for the default language. And you don't have to populate that because Translation Builder, will automatically use the name, of the dataset object. Now, if it's a column or measure, like image, category, or product, it doesn't include the table name. It basically just uses the actual, name that you have named it in Power BI Desktop. Okay, we have a new project. We opened it up, but we haven't done any work yet. You do work to add translations, starting by adding 1 or more secondary languages. So using Translation Builder on a brand new project, I could click the Add Language button. That is going to prompt me with the Add Language dialog. So let's say I pick a language of Spanish as the first secondary language I want to add in. So we'll go ahead, click Add Language, and note I get a new column in the translation grid. Above it, you can also see under secondary languages, just under the Add Language button, now we're showing Spanish. Okay, let's say that I have a couple more languages. So once again, we click Add Language, but this time I'm going to hold down the Control key so I can enable multiple selection. So if I want to pick 2 or 3 or 4 languages at once and add them in, I can do that. And note that once you add these languages in, now there's going to be 1 column for each secondary language that you add in. Now let's say that you added a language by mistake and you want to remove it. The way that Translation Builder allows you to do that is if you go to the column in question, let's say that I've added German accidentally, I want to remove it. So then you right click on the column header and there will be a delete secondary language command. When you execute that command, it will ask you to confirm what you're doing, because you will be effectively, deleting all the translations that you might have added, into that language. So if you're sure that you really want to get rid of it, we'll say go ahead and okay. And note that when you do that, then the column will disappear from the translation grid, and up in the secondary languages list up above, right under the add language button, you'll also see it missing from that after it's been deleted. Okay, let's go through one of the first important steps of the lab exercise, which is, with your project open, we're going to start up Translations Builder here. And note that at first, secondary languages are empty. We only have 4 columns, so we don't have any secondary languages yet. We'll say add language. We'll keep it simple. We'll go ahead and we'll add Spanish. And now we have a column, of editable cells. So let's say I just put my cursor, over and select the first cell. And then I just start typing. This, hit enter, is, hit enter, easy, hit enter. And the idea is we want to make it very, quick and easy if you know how to type in translations, to set your keyboard up for the right, international settings, and then just type them in, if that's something you're able to do. Wow, that was pretty easy. Let's review the steps again. Select a cell, begin typing, hit enter to save your changes and move down 1 cell. Now you can see that if I was a content creator, who speaks both English and Spanish, and I'm able to put it in the Spanish translations myself, well, we can go ahead and test this to see what it looks like. Now, a quick word, and that is, as you work with Translations Builder, it can make changes to the dataset in memory, but it can't force Power BI Desktop to actually save those changes to the underlying PBX file. So before we test, we're always going to come back here, and this little save icon at the top left, as you work with Translation Builder, before you publish for testing, you're always going to click Save here. Okay, now that we're ready for testing, I'm going to go to the Power BI service once more, just to make sure my target workspace has the diamond. Remember, it has to be a premium content workspace for translations to load properly, as of January 2023. So now what we'll do is we'll go back to Power BI Desktop. We'll go ahead and we'll publish. And now I should be able to come back up here and kind of find my particular workspace. In our case right here, it's the Dev Camp Labs. Let's go ahead and publish our work. And as we publish our work, it should come back in a second and tell us that it has succeeded. Now that it's done that, I should be able to come back here. If I go ahead and look at this, I should see that the refresh date is the date right now. Let's go ahead and open that up. Now, at first, when I open it up, since the default language and locale is English in the United States, that's what it shows by default. But now what we're going to do is we're going to come up here and we're going to start by adding a question mark. We're now going to put in the language parameter and equals, and Spanish is ES, and then the region is Spain, so it's language equals ES, and I'll just go ahead and hit enter. And the first thing I should see is the surrounding Power BI user experience, switches over to the target language, which in this case is Spanish. I also see that within my report, I see things like within this particular table visual, things like Producto, Imagen. My accent's not very accurate, but what you can see is that now I'm showing my Spanish translations there. If we go down and look at the card visuals, here at the bottom, also I see, the metadata translation showing up for that. In just a little bit, we'll talk a little bit more about how visuals, once you add metadata, if you kind of leave the default title for a visual, it's just kind of created on the fly from the metadata, and those are translated properly. If I move over to the second page right here, I can see that, in this visual, we hard-coded a title, so that doesn't change. That's a future work item that we have to fix, in a future video in this series. But for this part right here, what we can see is that, we have indeed changed the metadata translations, and tested them. Okay, we've just gone through the steps to test our work, as we add and edit translations. We want to make sure that they appear properly in the browser, when we access the report in the Power BI service. So one of the observations here is that Power BI Desktop, in the way that it's implemented the analytics engine, doesn't load metadata translations. So you can't really test them in Power BI Desktop. There are some other types of translations we could test in Power BI Desktop, but for the metadata translations, you really have to publish to the Power BI service, and then I just recommend using the language tag, to do your testing. So the pattern that we will continually repeat, when you are working on a project to add multi-language support to a Power BI project, is that you will add translations to the data set, using Translations Builder. You will go back to Power BI Desktop, you will save your work, and then you will publish to the Power BI service. Then you will move to the Power BI service and you'll use the language parameter in the report URL to test secondary language 1 and 2 and 3, as you go through and you do your testing. And then this is a process that we just, continually repeat. Okay, let's summarize what we've just learned. Now, let's say you're not using the language parameter in the report URL. Well, in that case, the Power BI service is just going to determine the user's language and locale, by looking at the user's browser settings. So whatever they've set up in Chrome or Edge, will basically dictate how the user context gets loaded, as the report is loading. Now, what we've seen, is that the language parameter, can influence, the user context for both the language and or the locale that you pass in. And so that's how we do our testing, especially if we have 3 or 4 different secondary languages, and I want to test the first and second and third one, it's just having the language parameter in the URL. So setting the language parameter, is really what allows you to test the metadata for all your languages. One last little helpful tip before we conclude this section, and that is, since you're continually testing and you're required to add the language parameter to test secondary language 1 and 2 and 3, it's helpful to create a set of browser bookmarks just to remember that, so you're not continually going back to the address bar and having to update it. Let's look at a simple example. Back here in the Power BI service, in my browser, the first thing I'll do is I'll go to Bookmarks and I'll say Show Bookmarks Bar. Now, I look at this URL up top here, and you're going to see what I have selected, goes through the path of the workspace GUID and the report GUID, but I haven't selected the report page. Don't really care about that one for what we're doing here. And so now what we're going to do is we'll go ahead and we'll create a new bookmark. Once I go ahead and I create the bookmark, what am I going to name this? And I'll just name this one English. Seems to be the right name. Where am I going to put it? How about the bookmarks bar? If I go back up there and I choose edit, you can kind of see what the bookmark looks like. And once again, I need to kind of get all the way up to the report. But if I want, I can go ahead and trim off the things, there at the end. And I'll go ahead and save this one as well. So now that I've got that, let's go ahead and up top here, just like we did before, we're going to put in the question mark. We'll say now language equals ES-ES. We'll go ahead, hit OK. We're going to make sure this loads in. Now we'll create a new bookmark. This one is going to be Spanish. And now that we've created this bookmark and we come back here, we can look, and what we'll see here is, once again, I can get rid of the page if I don't need it, but what we need here, is at the very end, to have the question mark language equals ES-ES. And so, now that we've set this up, let's go ahead and, we'll look at the card visuals down here at the bottom with English. They look good. Okay, now let's test for Spanish. And we'll look down here, and as we add more languages, through the lab exercise track, we'll continue to add more bookmarks, each time we have a secondary language. And once again, it's just to facilitate testing, make it easier, and make it go faster. We have now concluded part 2. So onwards and upwards to part 3, generating machine translations.